We begin the Gemara at the beginning of Daf Daled, third line from the top of the Amud. We're holding where it says Ella. Ella la'olam Rabba Lazahi. So the Gemara here is discussing the opinion of Rabba. Rabba says that when it said in the Mishnah that a shliach that delivers a get from Medina Sayyam, from overseas, to Eretz Yisrael, he must testify that the get was written and signed in front of him. B'fanei nichtav and b'fanei nechtam. Rabba says the reason is because we have to verify that the get was written lishma. One of the halachas of the way a get is written. But the discussion of the Gemara is, whose opinion is this going according to? There are Tanoim that spoke about this, Rab Meir and Rab Elazar. And the argument is, Rab Meir says only the signatures have to be lishma. When the Torah says v'kasav, it really refers to the signatures. And according to Rab Elazar, only the writing of the get has to be lishma. Actually, Rab Elazar's opinion is a get doesn't even need signatures. The edim that are there for the kashrus of the get are just there when you give over the get from the ish to the isha. But there's no signatures at all. So according to who is the Mishnah saying that the get has to be written and signed lishma? That's our question. So the Gemara here answers and says, Elo, the answer to this is, La'olam Rabba Lazahi. Really, I'll tell you that our Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabba Lazar. Now, when it says, when we said before, we proved before that Rabba Lazar does not require any signature at all on the get. So obviously, a signature does not have to be lishma. That's heiche de leke edim klal. That's if there are no edim that are signed in the get at all. But heiche de ikke edim. But if you are putting signatures into the get, then those signatures in the get do have to be lishma. Because Rabba said regarding the opinion of Rabba Lazar, Rabba Lazar will agree that if you have a forgery inside the get, then this is possible. What was Rabba speaking about? What does it mean, a forgery inside the get? If you sign a get with edim that are not kosher, you put an edim that are relatives or other kinds of edim that are puzzle, and you put the signatures in the get. So you may think, according to Rabba Lazar, since you don't need edim at all, so what difference does it make? You want to put signatures into the get, you can put signatures of whatever you want. Put signatures of little children, put signatures of a relative. You anyways not relying on those edim. According to Rabba Lazar, the main edim are the ones that are there when you give the get. Says Rabba, that's not the case. If you don't have any edim, then it's fine. But if you put edim that are puzzle, then what happens is, Rashi later explains, people are going to make the mistake and say, oh, these are kinds of edim that are actually reliable. They're good. Maybe for a get, even possible edim, I can rely on them. You may come to use those edim for the edus of the Mesirah, when you give the get to the Isha. So therefore, possible edim are not allowed to be signed in a get. Similar, the Gemara is saying here regarding the din of Lishma. The halach of Lishma, according to Rabba Lazar, is when you give the get. So therefore, if you're going to sign the get with edim that are not going to be signed lishma, so then a person might think that even the edim later, when you give the get, does not have to be lishma. So once you put the signatures of the edim inside the get, it has to be properly done with lishma. That's Rashi's pshat in the Gemara. Taisa has a different pshat here. Taisa says that when it says in the Gemara mezuyif mitayche, what it's basically saying is that this is a gzeira. Similar to the point that the Gemara was saying before, really, that true, according to Rabba Lazar, minat Torah, only the writing of the get has to be lishma, not the signatures. But Rabba Lazar's concern is that if you're going to sign in the get, edim, and you're going to sign it not lishma, a person may come to make the mistake and say, if this section of the get does not have to be lishma, the signatures, so then maybe the writing also doesn't have to be lishma. So therefore, Chacham will geyser, according to Rabba Lazar, that the signatures also have to be lishma. If I can mention quickly one more pshat in this Gemara, it's a very famous pshat here, what it means when it says mezuyif mitaychai, and this is the pshat according to the Rif's opinion. The Rif's opinion is, we're discussing Rabba Lazar's opinion in our Gemara, and from the simple pshat of the Gemara, it seems that according to Rabba Lazar, the only edim that you could use for a get is when you give the get to the Isha. The signatures in the get, the Gemara before said, tikkun olam. If you want to have them there, you can have them there, but it's not, that's not really the edus that's needed for the get. The Rif's opinion is that Rabba Lazar, when he says that the edim are the ones that are there when you give the get, that's one option. Rabba Lazar holds you have two options. You can either have signatures on the get, or you can have the edim that are there when you give the get. Rav Meir's opinion is you have only one option. You must have signatures on the get. And the edim that you have later when you give over the get is a different story. That has nothing to do with the kashrus of the get itself. Rabbi Elazar's opinion is, the language that the Rif says is, af eidei mesira karti. You could have both. You could have eidei chesima or eidei mesira. So therefore, according to the Rif, essentially what our Gemara is saying is, if you have no eidim at all, so then obviously that is eidei chesima, eidim that's signed in the get. So obviously there's no chesima here, there's no lishma that applies to that. But if you are putting signatures, according to Rabbi Elazar, signatures does work. It's also an option. So when you put signatures in the get, then the halacha of the signatures that it has to be lishma applies. And therefore, possibly according to this Riv, when the Gemara here says, that means even minatayra. Now that you're putting the signatures, it does have to be proper signatures and it has to be lishma. Okay, so now the Gemara brings another teretz to this. So this is according to Rabbi Elazar, but Ravashi says, Hamani Rabbi Yehudahi. Who's the Tana of our Mishnah that requires both the writing and the signature to be lishma? This is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Because we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, Paisel, Rabbi Yehuda says a get would be pasul achetehei ksivasai v'chasimosei betalish. Both the writing of the get and the signature of the get has to be when it's detached from the ground. As we saw before, one of the halachas of a get is it may not be written when it's attached to the ground. But so Rabbi Yehuda says that this halacha of how a get has to be written applies both to the writing and the signature. So therefore over here, when it comes to the halacha of lishma, it's the same thing. The halacha of lishma applies both to the writing and to the signature. That's why we say b'fanei nichtav and b'fanei nechtam. Frek the Gemara, wait a minute. If this is so simple, we have the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda here. So right from the beginning of this whole discussion, my time Rabbi Yehuda. Why did we not bring that this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, our Mishnah? And says the Gemara, Mahadrina na Rab Meir. We were trying to figure out if our Mishnah could follow Rab Meir's opinion because the Stam Masnisan Rab Meir. Because we have a rule that when you have a Mishnah that has no name in it, a Stam Mishnah is Rab Meir. So here we have a Stam Mishnah, so it would be logical to say that it's Rab Meir, not Rab Yehuda. And also, on the other hand, Madrina na Rabbi Elazar, we were trying to see if our Mishnah would fit with Rabbi Elazar's opinion, because the Kaima law and Hilchas Kavasei beGittin, because the halacha is according to Rabbi Elazar when it comes to Gittin, so therefore we wanted to try to fit our Mishnah, which is a Stam Mishnah, according to the halacha, which is Rabbi Elazar. So therefore, the previous answer here was saying that it goes according to Rabbi Elazar. Okay, there's a discussion here in Tosfos and the Rishonim, here in the Gemara, it says this expression, Hilchas Kavasei beGittin. Sounds like the Gemara is saying we only paskin like Rabbi Elazar regarding a get. How about other shtaris? The same argument between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar could apply to any document, a money document or any other document. What's the main koyach of the shtar? The signatures on it? Or the fact that when for example, a borrower gives the shtar to the lender, it's given in front of Adam, without signatures. So here our Gemara says Hilchas Kavasei beGittin. But most Rishonim say, even though it uses the term Gittin, the halacha is like Rabbi Elazar regarding all documents, that the main koyach of the shtar is not with the signatures in it, but with the edim that are there when the shtar is handed over, like Rabbi Elazar's opinion. Okay, now the Gemara comes back to various different parts of our Mishnah to try to prove whether Rabbi's opinion fits with our Mishnah, that the main issue here is the concern about Lishma, or Rava's opinion fits with what it says in our Mishnah, that our main concern about this get that's coming from Chutz La'aretz is regarding the fact that the signatures may have been forged. So Tanan, it said in our Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel argues with the Tanakama. Rabbi Gamliel says, Afa mevi min harekem u'min hacheger. Even a get that's brought from outside Eretz Yisrael, from a city that's very close to the border, you still will have to testify that it was written and signed in front of the shliach. The shliach will have to testify that is. So the Tanakama held that you don't have to, right? As the Gemara here will say in a moment. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Afilu mikfar ludim lelud." Even a get that's brought from this town called Kfar Ludim to Lud, which is not only close to Eretz Yisrael, but it's also sort of swallowed up by Eretz Yisrael. As I explained, and Rashi here explains it by Riches, that it's on all three sides, has boundaries from Eretz Yisrael. As Rashi explains, obviously when it comes to a border is usually not in a straight line. You have cities that go in, go out, go in, go out. So you could have two cities that protrude out, and then in between you have another city that's further in, and that's what's called Muvla'is. It's sort of swallowed up by the border of Eretz Yisrael. So even if you bring a get from that location, still you'll have to say b'fanei nichta b'fanei nechtam. V'amar Abaye, when he spoke about Kfar Ludim to Lud, so he said that, what are we speaking about over here? We're speaking about a city that's very close to Eretz Yisrael, and it's even more so swallowed up, surrounded from all three sides by a border of Eretz Yisrael. And another thing, I saw this area from Kfar Ludim to Lod, and he gave an example for the people living then in Bavel to understand what we're speaking about. So, it's like the distance of Beit Kubi to Pumbedisa, which apparently is very close. That was the distance from Kfar Ludim to Lod. Okay, so these are the two opinions brought in the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, which are arguing regarding places that are very close to Eretz Yisrael. Now, Meklal, from this I could understand the Tanakama Sava. What does the Tanakama of our Mishnah hold? His opinion is that Hani Leitzarech, these places that are so close to Eretz Yisrael, the Shliach does not have to testify b'fan anichta, b'fan anechtam. Now, my love, don't you think, that we could explain the basis of the machlokes of the Tanakama with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah? We could say that they're arguing in the same machlokes of Rabba and Rava. What is the purpose of testifying b'fan anichta, b'fan anechtam? The Mar Savar lefi she'ein b'kiyin l'shma. The Tanakama of our Mishnah says that the reason that you have to testify is because we're concerned that people outside of Eretz Yisrael don't know the halacha of l'shma. But for Hani, these people living in these cities that are so close to Eretz Yisrael, Gemiri, they know the halachas because they go to learn in the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. They go to a bedin in Eretz Yisrael, so they know the halachas. But Amar Savar, on the other hand, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, that say that even if it's very close to Eretz Yisrael, you still have to say b'fan anichta, b'fan anechtam. Their opinion is that the concern is that the get is coming from a place where the edim are not going to be found, are not going to be available to verify the signatures if there'll be a problem. And the Gemara says, Vahani Nami, even these places that are very close to Eretz Yisrael, loy shchichi. Perhaps we could say that it's not common for people to be able to travel often. And Rashi says the reason is because once it's over the border, it's outside of Eretz Yisrael, so there's some kind of a chedam, there's some kind of a difficulty to cross over the border, and therefore the travel between these areas into Eretz Yisrael is not so common. So on one hand, regarding Gemiri, we could say that from time to time people travel when they have to go to yeshiva, when they want to go learn, or they want to go to a bezdin. They'll go over the border. And therefore the people that are here know the halachas, because they're close enough to Eretz Yisrael that they go to learn in Eretz Yisrael. But on the other hand, as far as regular travel from one place to another, there's a border, and it's difficult to travel the border. So when you're going to have to find the Eidim to verify signatures, it's going to be difficult to find those Eidim to verify the signatures. It's called loy shchichi. And therefore, according to Rava, we could say that Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer is following Rava's opinion that you're going to still have to say b'fan anichta, b'fan anechtam. So that would be the explanation of our Mishnah. So right here we see that they're arguing the same machlokes as Rabba and Rava. Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily. Rabbi Metaretz l'taimei. Rabbi could explain all opinions in the Mishnah like his reasoning, and Rabbi Metaretz l'taimei. And Rabbi could explain all reasons in the Mishnah like his reasoning. Rabbi Metaretz l'taimei. Rabbi will explain according to his reasoning. To Kula Alma, everybody agrees that the reason you have to testify that the get was written and signed in front of the shliach, l'fishein b'kiyin l'shma. The reason is because we're concerned that they don't know the halacha of l'shma. Now, so what is the argument here when you have these places that are very close to the border? Here the argument is as follows, and the Gemara explains all three opinions. Tanakama Savar, the Tanakama's opinion is Hani, even the Smucha is Migmagmiri, like we said before, because it's very close to Eretz Yisrael. So they go, they travel, they learn in the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, and they know the halachas. So you don't have to say b'fan anichta, b'fan anechtam. Now, Rabbi Gamliel on this, Rabbi Gamliel argues and says it depends. Move la'ois, cities that are mamish swallowed into the border of Eretz Yisrael. They have the border on all three sides. Gemiri over there, those are people that are very much mingling with people from Eretz Yisrael, so therefore they know the halachas. But smuchais, the cities that are near the border, like Gemiri, no, they are not so. They're not surrounded by the people of Eretz Yisrael, so they do not know the halachas. And also Rabbi Eliezer then Rabbi Eliezer argues further and he says, Muvlois Nami, even those cities that are totally surrounded by Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless, when you bring from there a get to Eretz Yisrael, you also will have to testify about this get. Why? Not because they don't know. Rabbi Eliezer agrees that they mingle with people of Eretz Yisrael and they know the halachas, but nevertheless, Shalei Tachlak b'Medinas Hayam. Once Chachamim established the Gzeira, they wanted it to be clear and rigid, that you should know any get brought from outside the border, you have to say, we're not going to start making any distinctions. The moment you make distinctions, it's going to get confusing. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says, it doesn't matter. A city outside of the border, even if it's surrounded from all sides of Eretz Yisrael, you're still going to have to testify about the kashrus of this get, that it's written Lishma. Now, very similar, we can say that according to Rave, he explains the whole Mishnah that it could all be based on his reasoning. The Kula Alme, everybody could agree that the reason why the Shliach has to testify is that we're concerned that if there'll be a question about the authenticity of the signatures, we won't have the Edom available to verify this. Now, the Tanakama says, Hani, these cities here that are very close to the border, even the Smuchai, since it's so close, Mishkach Shichi. So it is close enough that it is available for people to travel through to be able to come and testify. And perhaps at this point, the Gemara sort of changes of what it thought before. I mentioned before that in the Havamina, the Gemara thought that to cross a border was a big deal. There was some kind of a chayrum. Rashi says that it was hard to cross the border. But now the Gemara is saying, no, it's a deus. There is a border, but it's easy to cross through. So therefore, the Tanakama says that there's no reason to testify about this get because the Edom will always be available to authenticate their signatures. Oh, so Rabbi Gamliel Meimar. Then Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says, Muvloi shchichi. That no, only those cities that are swallowed into the border from all three sides, they travel very commonly to Eretz Yisrael. But Smuchais, yes, it could be near the border, but they're a town for themselves. They have their own things, and therefore Lo shchichi. They have their produce on their own, they have their life on their own, and therefore they don't commonly travel into Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, you still will have to testify for the kashrus of the signatures because perhaps the Edom won't be available. Then Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, like we said before, Muvlois, Nami, even those cities that are all totally swallowed into the border, nevertheless, you also have to testify, Shaloi Tachlek b'Medina Sayam, in order not to make any distinctions, so it shouldn't become confusing. Okay, continuing to the next part of the Mishnah. Tanan, the Mishnah continues and says, V'chachomim ma'imrim, the Chachomim said, Ein tzarech shiyayim ha'befanei nichta befanei nechtam. The Shliach does not have to testify that the get was written and signed in front of him. Ella, only Hamevi Mimedina Sayam, a get that's being brought from outside Eretz Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael. And then he added Veha Melech, and also a get that's being brought from Eretz Yisrael to Medina Sayam. Now, what do we understand from this? Meklal, from this it seems, the Tana Kama Savar, that the first opinion of the Mishnah that did not mention about the get that's being brought from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, what's his opinion? So the Tana Kama holds, Mailech Loitzarech, a get that's being brought from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. You don't need to testify about the kashrus of the get. So what is the argument here? What is the argument whether a get that's being brought from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, whether you have to testify about its kashrus or not? My love, don't you think? They're arguing about this argument of Rabba and Rava. The Tanakhama says the issue is that a get being brought specifically from Chutz La'aretz, people don't know the halacha of Lishma. So only when you bring it from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael is that an issue. Not the other way around though. But Vahani, Gemiri, the people in Eretz Yisrael know the halacha. So a get that's being brought from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, there's no issue whatsoever. But Amar Savar, then the Chachamim in the Mishnah, their opinion is the issue is the distance. The issue is not Chutz La'aretz. So if the issue is the distance, whichever direction you're going, whether from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael or from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, either way, the Eidim are not available to validate their signatures. So you're going to have to testify. The Shliach, we want him to testify that these signatures are valid. Says the Gemara, no, again, there's no proof from this part of the Mishnah. Rabbi could explain the Mishnah. Rabbi, that is, could explain the Mishnah according to his reasoning, and Rabbi will explain according to his reasoning. Rabbi will explain according to his reasoning. The Kula Alme Lefi She'ein B'Kiyin L'Shma. Everybody could agree. The only reason you're testifying about the kashrus of the get is because we're concerned that they don't know the halacha of L'Shma. But v'hacha, over here, b'gzeiras moilech ha'tomei v'kamiflagi. The question is, did Chachamim institute an additional decree in order not to forget and not to confuse one direction with the other? They said that just like when you bring it to Eretz Yisrael, you have to testify, so too when you bring it from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, you also have to testify, in order for people not to confuse the two. That was the machlekes over here. The Tana Kama Savar, Loigas Dinin Moile Chatamevi. Chachamim did not include this additional gezeire that just like when you bring it, you have to say, so too when you bring it out from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, you also have to say, there's no such gezeire. Rabbanan Basroi Savri, then the Chachamim in the Mishnah, their opinion is, Gazrinon Moile Chatamevi. There's a gezeire. True, as far as the reason for why you would have to testify, it should only apply when you deliver the get to Eretz Yisrael, but nevertheless, Chachamim decreed that in either direction you should have to say, so people should not confuse the two. That is Rabbe's explanation of our Mishnah. And Rave explains the way you understand the Mishnah according to his reasoning. Again, so Rava's explanation is that you have to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam to validate the signature because we're concerned because of the distance. Because of the distance, we're concerned that the Eidim won't be available. So therefore, how does Rav explain our Mishnah? The Kula Alma, everybody in our Mishnah agrees, Lefi she'ein Eidim etzuyin l'kaimai. The concern is that if because of the distance, the Eidim are not available. Rabban and Basroi, now when we have the Chachamim in the Mishnah that say that the Takana goes in either direction, delivering or bringing out from Eretz Yisrael, Lefrushi Taime the Tanakam Udasu. They, the Chachamim, are just coming to elaborate and explain the opinion of the Tanakama. They're not arguing on the Tanakama. True, the Tanakama did not mention the case where the get is being brought out of Eretz Yisrael, but the Chachamim are coming to explain what the Tanakama means. And therefore there's no argument here. Either direction, because of the distance, you'll have to say, B'fanei nichtav, b'fanei nechtam. The Gemara continues to the next part of the Mishnah. Tanan, it says in the Mishnah, Hamevi get, mimedine, limedine, bimedine sayam. A get is being delivered from one country to another in Medina Sayam, somewhere in Chutz La'aretz. So there, the shliach delivering has to testify that the get was written and signed in front of him. Now, what do we understand from this Mishnah? The Mishnah says specifically you're bringing it from one country to another. But if it was all in the same country, you're bringing it from one city to another within the same country, even though it's outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's not necessary for the shliach to testify that the get was written properly. Now, why not? Says the Gemara, according to Rave, since our whole concern is about the distance, that the Eidim won't be available, so if it's in the same country, there's no problem. But l'Rabbe kashya, but according to Rabbe, if our concern is that it's being written in a place where we don't know if the people all know the halacha of l'shma, so according to Rabbe, it's a question. What difference does it make? One country, two countries, it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. There's a concern that it may have been written shaloi l'shma. Says the Gemara, according to Rabbe, loy teime, don't be medayik from our Mishnah that ba'oisam medina b'medina sayam loy tzarich, that only from one country to another do you have to. But within the same country, if it's outside of Eretz Yisrael, then it's not necessary to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam, ella rather be medayik differently. What the Mishnah is coming and saying is that only from one country to another in Medina Sayam is it necessary to testify b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam. But medina le'medina b'Eretz Yisrael, a get being brought from one location to another, or really from one country to another within Eretz Yisrael itself, lo tzarich. There, it's not necessary to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam. So in other words, this is following all Rabba's reasoning. Rabba's reasoning is, if you're anywhere in Medina Sayam, you're going to have to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam, whether it's from one country to another, or even within the same country, because people there don't know the halacha of l'shma. When the Mishnah writes Medina le'Medina b'Medina Sayam, that there you have to say, the diuk that you should understand from this is that in Eretz Yisrael, when it's even from one country to another, Rashi mentioned before, this means, let's say, from the Galil, from the north, all the way down to the south, or to Yehuda and another section of Eretz Yisrael, that there you don't have to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam, based on Rabba's opinion, because in Eretz Yisrael, everyone knows the halacha of l'shma. Asks the Gemara on this, why would you have to learn this out from this part of the Mishnah? The point that in Eretz Yisrael, the shliach does not have to testify about the kashas of the get, that the Mishnah says later, clearly. The Mishnah later says, Hamevi get be'eretz Yisrael, and it's tzarich laim b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam. A get being delivered within Eretz Yisrael, the shliach does not have to testify about the kashas of the get. So why are you telling me that earlier on, when it says in the Mishnah, Medina le'Medina b'Medina Sayam, that be medayik from there, that within Eretz Yisrael you don't have to say? The Mishnah spells it out clearly later. Answers the Gemara, no, the Mishnah would have to tell this to me twice. Why? Imahi. If I would only have the second time when the Mishnah says clearly that if you bring a get in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam, That's one pshat here. Rashi actually says, Im Yahi is going on the Reisha. If you'd only have the diuk of the Reisha, that you could learn out that in Eretz Yisrael you don't say, Hava Amina, then I would tell you, Hanamili Diyevet. That maybe only refers to a situation when it's after the fact. Once the get was already delivered, so now the get was delivered, and the shliach did not see the writing of the get. He did not see the signature of the get. So at this point, it's too late. He can't testify about the b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. He didn't see anything. Then I would say maybe b'diyevet in Eretz Yisrael you don't have to say. Aval lechatchila, I would still think that even in Eretz Yisrael it's better. Lechatchila, even in Eretz Yisrael, it would be a good idea that let the shliach delivering the get know what's going on, let him see, and he should testify b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. So again, lechatchila, it's not good. The shliach should not take the get without seeing what happened. Kamash Malan. Therefore, the Mishnah tells me a second time that in Eretz Yisrael there's no halacha of b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechtem at all. Not b'diyevet and not lechatchila. Doesn't apply at all. Okay, this is all one version of the discussion regarding this part of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara brings another approach of how this discussion went in this part of the Mishnah. The Ekademaisiv law, there are others, when they were asking on the opinions of Rabba and Rava from this part of the Mishnah, they asked it as follows, Hachi, as follows. What did it say in this part of the Mishnah? What were we quoting here? The Mishnah said, Hamevi get min medina le medina be medina sayam. You bring a get from one country to another in Medina Sayam, so you have to testify b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechtam. So now, according to this version, we're medayik from the Mishnah as follows: Ha mi medina le medina be'eretz Yisrael. But if you're bringing the get from one country to another within Eretz Yisrael itself, lo tzarich, it's not necessary to testify for the kashrus of the get. So over here, the question is going to be now on Rava. According to Rabbe, if the get is being brought from one country to another within Eretz Yisrael, we understand. There's nothing to testify about. It's in Eretz Yisrael. People know the halacha of the Shema. But according to Rave, it's a question because it's coming from a distant location. Even if it's in Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't matter. Answers the Gemara, Loi Teime, don't be medayik that min Medina le Medina be'Eretz Yisrael, Loi Tzarech, that from one country to another in Eretz Yisrael, it's not necessary to testify. It is, because it's also distant. Eloheim, rather be medayik as follows: Ha ba'oisa Medina be'Medina Sayam, a get being brought from one city to another within the same country in Medina Sayam, there Loi Tzarech, there you don't have to say because it's not coming from a distant location. So again, over here, according to this approach, we're trying to make the Mishnah fit with Rava's opinion. But the Gemara presses on further. Aval, but what would this mean? Medina le Medina be'Eretz Yisrael mai. From one country to another, what would be the halacha in Eretz Yisrael? Tzarech? You're telling me that over there in Eretz Yisrael, as long as it's coming from a distant location in Eretz Yisrael, if it's coming from another country, then tzarech. So according to Rava's interpretation, it would be necessary to say b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. Say if so, lisni hamevi mimedina lemedina stam. Let the Mishnah say a get that's brought from one country to another because it's distant. So you have to say b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. Why would the Mishnah add those words b'medina sayam? Why is it saying that only if it's a distant location in Medina Sayam? Whether it's Eretz Yisrael or Medina Sayam, according to Rava, it doesn't matter. The main thing is the point that it's from one country to another because it's distant. So why is it adding those words, Medina Sayam? So the Gemara changes and says, La'olam, really I can tell you, Medina le Medina be'Eretz Yisrael, nami lo tzarech. That the truth is, Rava will agree, even though it's a distant location from one country to another within Eretz Yisrael, you're not going to have to testify about the get. According to Rava, we're concerned that we don't have Eidim available to validate their signatures. And if it's in a distant location, why should you not have to testify about this? Says the Gemara, Eretz Yisrael is different. And that the reason is, Kivin, the Ikke, Oile Regalim, because Yidden are Oile Regel. 3 times a year, they're coming to the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, Mishkach Shchichi, people are traveling from one end of Eretz Yisrael to another. They meet up along the way, or they meet up in Yerushalayim. There are various Pirushim and Mefarshim about this, but because there's so much travel, because of the Aliyah L'Regel of Yantiv, so they end up meeting each other. So even if it's from a distant location, you're going to find the Eidim necessary to validate their signatures. Asks the Gemara on this, Tainach, Bisman Beis HaMikdash Kayim. This is a good answer for the time when the Beis HaMikdash is standing and there's the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. Bisman Shem Beis Hamikdash Kayam, but when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, so you can't anymore say that people are being Oile Regel. Ma Yikala Meimar. So what are you going to say now? This Gzeira and this our Mishnah is being taught after the time of the Churban. So and still the Mishnah here is saying only Medina Lemedina B'Medina Sayam. But in Eretz Yisrael, from one location to another, you will not have to say B'Fana Nichta B'Fana Nechtam. Why is that? And says the Gemara, even after the Churban, Eretz Yisrael was still different. Kivin the Ikke Bate Dinim the Kvi, because Eretz Yisrael has established courts, established Bate Dinim in many locations in Eretz Yisrael. Mishkach Shchichi, people are traveling from one bezin to another. People have to resolve their issues, and therefore there is travel that happens from one location to another, and people could end up meeting each other, or perhaps people could figure out where those Eidim are. They can go to that bezdin that's in that location. There's sort of there is central locations where people meet in a bezdin. Rashi calls the bezdin over here a beis vad. It's sort of a meeting place where people that have to resolve their issues, they know where to go. They know where they can find a bezdin to resolve their issues. So therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, even if it's coming from a distant location, there's no concern that you may not have those Eidim available. So Rabbi will agree, Rabbi will agree that you don't have to say B'fanei nichta, B'fanei nechtam. So Rashi says that now, according to this, it comes out, if you remember, before in Daf Beis, the Gemara said one of the nafkeminis, one of the differences between Rabbi and Rava was whether a get being brought from one distant location to another in Eretz Yisrael, whether you have to testify b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechtam. The Gemara before said, according to Rava, you still do, because it's distant, even though it's in Eretz Yisrael, but it's a distant location. But now the Gemara is retracting from that. Now the Gemara is saying that even Rava will agree, in Eretz Yisrael itself, even a distant location, people are traveling from one place to another, and you don't have to say b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechtam. The Gemara goes now to the next part of the Mishnah. So the last point for today. So the next part of the Mishnah said, to Tanan, the Mishnah said, Rab Shimon Gamliel says, Afile mehagmanya lahagmanya. Even from one district to another, where you have two different jurisdictions, and they don't travel from one to another. There's a separation and there's sort of a border between them. And they don't, even though it's sort of two different cities that are right near each other, but because there's this hagmanya, and they can't travel from one to another, you're going to have to testify about the kashas of this get. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak said, Ir Achas Haisa Be'eretz Yisrael, there was a city in Eretz Yisrael, V'Asasius Shema, and the name of the city was Asasius, V'Hoya Ba Beis Hagmanius. Within the same city, there were two different districts, there were two different jurisdictions, and they were very particular that you stick to your part of the city, and we stick to our part of the city, and they did not mix with one another, and because of this, Leficha Chutzruchu Loima Magmaya Lagmaya. And therefore you have to testify about this get that's being brought from one district to another. Says the Gemara, now here we have a very clear raya for Rava. L'Rava niche. According to Rava, the Mishnah is basically clearly telling me that this is all in Eretz Yisrael. Everybody knows the halacha of Lishma, but what are we concerned about? That you're going to have a hard time accessing those witnesses that signed this get, because they're in a different district, it's in a different jurisdiction. So according to Rava, we understand that why the shliach has to testify for the kashas of the signatures when he brings his get. But according to Rabbe, why in such a case you have to testify? If the only concern is that it may have been written Shaloi Lishma, but this is in Eretz Yisrael, so it was written Lishma, what is our concern? So the Gemara concludes, because of this question, Rabbe Islay de Rave, that Rabbe agrees to Rave's concern. Meaning that Rabbe only came to add to what Rave says. Rave says the concern we have is about the signatures of the get. That the husband may come to challenge those signatures and say that it's a forgery, so we want to validate the signatures. Rabba agrees to that. Rabba is just adding another reason. Besides the concern we have about the signatures of the get, we additionally have a concern about the writing of the get, and maybe the signatures as well, that it was written Shaloi Lishma. So Rabba is agreeing to Rabba's opinion, he's just adding another reason. Says the Gemara, so now, based on this, Ela Mai Bei Nayu, so what's the practical difference between Rabba and Rava? Says the Gemara, the difference will be, Ikke Bei Nayu, the difference is, Das Yu Bei Trei. If the shluchim that are bringing the get, there's not one shliach bringing, but it's two shluchim bringing the get. So over here, this will still be a practical difference between Rabba and Rava. Rava that says that the only concern that we have is that we need people available to validate the signatures once you have two shluchim. So right now, you have those two shluchim, you're available to validate the get. That's good enough. But Rabbi that added a second reason, so Rabbi says, fine, you have shluchim to validate the signatures, but the concern that we have about the get that may have been written shalei lishma, the fact that you have two shluchim doesn't help me for that. It's coming from a place where people may use a get shalei lishma. So that nafkamina still remains. Inami ba'oisa medina b'medina sayam. Another practical difference between Rabba and Rava still remains if it's being brought within the same country in Medina Sayam. According to Rava, since our only concern is that it's coming from a distant location, so this is not a distant location. The Eidim are available. Rabba that adds a second reason, which is that it may have been written Shalei Lishma, so that still applies over here, even when it's being brought within the same location. But the other nafkamina that we said before, min medina le medina be'eretz Yisrael, that nafkamina does not apply anymore. There's the reason that the Gemara said before, because in Eretz Yisrael, mishkach shchichi, or now the Gemara is saying, Rabbi islay de Rabbi, so therefore, that nafkamina does not apply. Okay.